Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and what does it mean for India. As we record this on Monday, the 27th of February, the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its fifth day. The situation continues to be extremely critical, and the Ukrainian President Zelensky has described the next 24 hours as being crucial for the country. The humanitarian cost continues to mount as thousands of Ukrainians pour into they pour into Europe to escape the war, while several others join the fight against Russian troops. Meanwhile, President Vladimir Putin has put the nuclear deterrence forces on high alert in his first public reaction after the US and EU imposed stringent, wide ranging sanctions on banks, excluding the Russian banks from SWIFT, and also imposing sanctions on Russia's central bank. As the ruble already plunges to a new low against the dollar, there's rising concern about its impact on the Russian economy and the Russian people. This has now become an additional factor to watch out for and how it impacts Kremlin's calculations towards the ongoing invasion. Needless to say, the situation remains extremely volatile, and the outcome of this crisis is expected to have a far ranging impact on European security, on Russia's position in Europe and its engagement with the wider world, as well as the US foreign policy. This crisis has also posed several difficult questions for India and has led to a debate about the future of India's balancing act between the United States and Russia, which it has carried out rather successfully till now. In the light of its closer engagement with the United States, the growing closeness of the Russia China partnership, and the fallout of Ukraine crisis on all of these and related issues makes it all the more necessary to understand the implications for India. To help us understand these various aspects, we have a stellar panel joining us today. Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan is Professor of International Politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. The author and foreign policy analyst, Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, joining us. Then we have Mr. Nandan Unnikrishnan, who is a distinguished fellow at Observer Research Foundation and looks after the Eurasia program. Also, Dr. Himani Pant, research fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs. Welcome, everyone, and let's get started. Firstly, I will request all of you to kick off the discussion with a 5 to 7 minutes of initial remarks, focusing on your thoughts regarding the current situation, how India has reacted to it till now, and how do you think this crisis will affect India's policy going ahead. I will intervene after the 7 minute mark, just so that we have enough time for a more detailed discussion after these remarks are over. So, Professor Rajagopalan, may I request you to start first?
Thank you, Nivedita. I think as we see, what we are seeing currently is an acceleration of some of the trends that we have been witnessing over the last several years, as well as broad international politics go. I think in terms of the specifics of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think this was something that was somewhat unexpected in the sense that there was the hope that Russia was massing its forces around Ukraine more as a deterrence and more to put pressure, and that it will not actually invade, or if it did invade, it would be limited to the eastern parts of Ukraine, which Russia already controlled. So the fact that Russia has decided to go all in, I think, has come as a bit of a surprise. Equally surprising, I think, has been the limitations in terms of or the performance of the Russian military in terms of their progress so far. Now it's only been 3 or 4 days, so it is too early to make any judgments about it. And I think the fact that Russia hasn't fully advanced into Kiev or taken Kiev should not be taken as our sole sort of criteria. But nevertheless, it does appear that in many aspects, Russian planning has been found wanting. I mean, Russia has sent in police forces, for example, who were killed, which they should not have. I mean, it appears that Russia seriously underestimated Ukrainian resistance. What has also been a surprise is how quickly the Western countries, Western Europe and the US have come together to resist, to put sanctions and so on Russia. So one of the fears at the beginning of this crisis was that the United States, because of this crisis, might lose its growing focus on the Indo-Pacific, that it might get diverted, as it frequently has, to this other theater in Europe, which, considering that European countries are fairly powerful, they should have been able to take care of themselves. But the worry was that I think a lot of people expressed the worry that the United States might get dragged into Europe and lose its focus on the Indo-Pacific. But what we have seen is surprising, especially in the last 2 days, with a large number of European countries moving towards fairly harsh sanctions on Russia, moving to Germany, moving to increase its military budget to 2%, which it doesn't, which Americans had been asking for decades, but which Germany had always fallen short of. A massive rearmament program, emergency rearmament program in Germany, as also the kind of reaction in other countries, in Sweden, in Finland, which are now, in many ways, almost part of NATO since they joined the NATO summit a few days back. So I think that gives, in terms of the larger international politics that was set up by the crisis, I think there are some other concerns that we had about U.S. losing focus. Um, has not come to pass, and it is possible, in fact, that this action may have actually helped the United States move out of Europe, because if European countries are now willing to bear more of the burden of European security, then the United States can reduce its burden in Europe and focus again on the Indo-Pacific and on China. So I think that part of it is quite surprising. The second part, I mean, of course, we have seen the Russian president Putin sort of raising the nuclear alert status, but I would point out that it is from the lowest level, maybe one higher level, or we are not even sure exactly what the level is. But I am not. I think that is more an indication, quite possibly, that Russia intends to continue the war, and that it is just an indication to, or just a warning to the Western countries not to directly intervene. I do not think that it was a threat as such. I think it is more of a warning against escalation towards the Western European countries. How this will proceed further, I think the fact that talks are taking place is a good thing. I mean, it's otherwise it could be quite horrible. I mean, if it became an urban warfare, of course, it's going to be extremely distressing and terrible. But hopefully, they will figure out. Ukraine and Russia will figure out some way of coming to a settlement that would satisfy both of their requirements. But we have to wait and see. Let me stop here, and I'll be happy to discuss these points later. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Singh, would you like to proceed next?
Thank you, Nivedita. So maybe in my brief remarks, I'll sort of look at two or three aspects, the lead up to the crisis, sort of through a historical lens, uh, and then sort of briefly on what are Russian sort of war aims, do they have the capabilities, and the reaction from the West, and then maybe uh, what's India and how India looks at all this. So the backdrop, of course, as we know, goes back to the end of the Cold War. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was preceded by very high level discussions, if you recall, between the Soviet leadership and Western policymakers who left the possibility that should Russia retreat from Eastern Europe, NATO would not move further eastwards. So that famous phrase of not 1 inch east, which was sort of placed on the table. I think what we saw since 1997 was a renewed attempt by the West, by NATO, to sort of encapsulate and absorb these areas of Eastern Europe into the NATO sphere of influence. I think what we saw by the Russians in the Georgian conflict in 2014 is a pushback that's coming in and trying to sort of put the balance of power sort of back on the table. There's also an attempt, I think, by Russian policymakers to try and uh, restore the nuclear stability, nuclear balance, which it felt was disturbed after the US pull out of the ABM treaty in 2001, 2000. So I think there have been a whole range of dynamics that finally pushed matters to an edge in the last few weeks. I think what we're seeing now is the Russian military intervention is poised to overwhelm the Ukrainian regime. Will it succeed? I think their hand has, in some sense, been restrained by the ability to also look at the human costs of war. I think they're conscious of what happened in Afghanistan uh, in the 1980s, Iraq, Syria. They don't want to lose the Ukrainian people, so to speak. And I'm proceeding from the assumption that Ukraine is a diverse entity. Eastern Ukraine, as we know, has a whole lot of ethnic Russians, both around Crimea, the Black Sea coast, the Donbas regions, uh, and and then you have sort of the more moderate Ukrainians who got caught up in the last 7-8 years in an attempt to sort of heighten nationalism and bring out Ukrainian nationhood in a more sort of a narrower sense, so to speak. It's quite telling that Putin and Russian policymakers today are really using terms that go back to sort of the 1940s. The Ukrainian leadership, at least sections of it, using terms like neo-Nazis, extreme right-wing nationalists. So I think that is sort of the basis of the Russian military intervention at the highest stage, regime change, but also to delegitimize these forces in Ukraine. Uh, what are the other Russian war aims? I think there's an attempt to provide security and stabilize the frontiers of the Donbas regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Their border lines will now be sort of stabilized. They will, for all practical purposes, become independent republics. And then you, of course, have Crimea, which is already ceded to Russia back in 2014. And you will have maybe perhaps more territorial gains where Ukraine, in a sense, becomes a landlocked state. Uh, so, what will that rump Ukrainian state look like? What will be its orientation? I think that's where the next phase of this war will sort of play out, where on the one side, you'll have Russians calling for neutrality of this state, whatever is left of it. And of course, the West will try and pick up the pieces and uh, pull this state into its orbit. So I think that's where the opportunity lies for US Russia relations to now look beyond this phase of the conflict. Can they sort of neutralize this space? It becomes a buffer zone where neither Russian forces are deployed right to the edge of NATO, its eastern flank, or will we see a second phase of the struggle? I think so. So that's something which remains to be seen. As we know, you have a Ukrainian delegation at the moment in Belarus, about to start talks with the Russians. So you're seeing this sort of diplomacy and armed use of force sort of operating in tandem. It's still too uncertain to know what is the state within the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian military. So, for example, we have reports that the Ukrainian military, not the sort of the neo-Nazi brigades, but the Ukrainian military by itself is not really being targeted in the demilitarization campaign. They're focusing more on sort of missile sites, air defense systems, offensive arms. So let's see. I think there's a lot more to play out. I think finally on India, uh, the Indian policy has really been to show some sort of sympathy or empathy to Russian security interests. At the same time, India, of course, has to balance the idea of sovereignty and territorial integrity as a foundational principle of the modern international order. So I think there is that tension between the Indian position, but we saw back in 2014 when the first Ukraine crisis sort of blew out. It was a different government at the time in Delhi, and they sort of took a similar position, so to speak, where they try to straddle that. This time, the stakes, of course, are much higher because we're seeing a complete sort of a much more extensive armed intervention in Ukraine. So there is pressure, but I think India is not going to get sort of subdued to diminish its ties with Moscow, what it does bilaterally, because none of that really hurts the United States or the West. That will continue. What we could see is, of course, the US subsequently just putting pressure generally on Asian states in terms of the kinds of linkages that they're developing with Russia. So that'll be a very interesting time for Indian foreign policy, how they will carve out these insulated supply chains or financial linkages, trade linkages. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities there for sort of this non-dollar and new kinds of arrangements that will flourish. Regardless of where India does, those arrangements are a consequence of Western sanctions, which will have to come into place. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Unnikrishnan, if you would please.
Thank you, Nivedita. I mean, there is really, after these two, Professor Rajagopalan and Zorawar Daulet Singh have spoken, there is really very, very little that I could possibly add. I'm broadly in agreement, and I think both of them, I mean, barring some nuances, are also broadly in agreement that we have reached a stage where the next probably 48 or 72 hours will give us information or give us a picture on which we would be able to draw conclusions, at least about what some of the Russian aims are, with a little bit more certainty. Right now, it appears rather unclear. And I'll start with the Russian side at this point. We all know why we are there. So Zorawar, I think, has laid it out very clearly. So one doesn't have to go into it. I personally, two things that I think, at least I have been able to glean in the last few days, is that while there is some opposition, and if you were to look at social media particularly, you would think that Russia is awash in protests. But actually, if you look at the population, I mean, in the terms of particularly some public-private polls, as it were, that were taken, President Putin still retains a substantial amount of support. In fact, surprisingly, it appears that since yesterday, and or rather since day before and yesterday evening, his support has grown. So obviously there is a feeling among the Russian elite and those sections of the population that support that this problem requires a solution, and the solution may not necessarily lie, or rather that they do not have much faith in the ability of this solution being found at the negotiation table. I also have to say that I am a little at this stage, because of the insufficiency of information, somewhat conflicted. One is some of the tactics, particularly what Professor Rajagopalan referred to, of the Russian military appear inexplicable. I mean, the modern day warfare presupposes use of air force and suppression of enemy, at least electronic warfare capabilities. The Russians appear to have not done that fully, although the Ministry of Defense yesterday said that that Russia has complete control over Ukrainian airspace. Uh, it's true, but the Air Force, the usage of Air Force seems to have been minimal in terms of delivering bombardments or anything. Missiles have been relied on much more. On the other hand, that curious incident that Rajesh Rajagopalan referred to of a unit of police force finding itself somewhere on the front lines is absolutely inexplicable. There have also been reports of some units suddenly stranded for lack of uh, fuel for their vehicles, which again speaks of clearly either stretched logistics or just inadequate planning. So there are some things that don't gel well, uh, and combined with the fact that none of us really can state with certainty as to what the end goals of these Russian military campaign is, it is difficult to predict. For example, I am quite certain that Russia does not intend to occupy the whole of Ukraine. Russia doesn't want to end up bordering, because the purpose of the exercise is to stop having a border or NATO forces on your border. Now, if you go to the western borders of Ukraine, you yourself are arriving on the borders of NATO, as it were. So I personally feel, secondly, the cost of maintaining that occupation is something I think the Russians recognize would be very, very high. So then what is the purpose? I personally believe that I think the Russians thought that they will be able to effect successful regime change. And I suspect that they were banking on what Zorawar referred to as the diversity of the Ukrainian populations and the differing political predilections of these sections, diverse sections. But the fierceness of the Ukrainian resistance, I think, was underestimated. And the reason I say that is that I've spoken to some of my Ukrainian friends, and some of them are of ethnic Russian stock, and they are opposed to the intervention by the Russians. They feel that the Russians have overstepped. In fact, one of them told me that it was understandable if they would try for a push to the south so as to cut off Ukraine from Azov Sea, as well as establish a land bridge to the Crimeans and expand the borders of Donetsk and Lugansk. But going for Kiev is something they don't understand. But maybe regime changes explains that. But I agree with Rajesh that it's early days yet, and the next 48 hours maybe will give us some indication. As far as what the West has done beyond, what Zorawar tried, I think one self goal, in a sense, that the Russians have scored so far is that they have expedited Western unity. There was an attempt to play on the differences between the Europeans and the United States, but that seems to have not worked fully. Those differences still remain because it's evident in the approach to SWIFT. Although they are agreeing to implement SWIFT, but they want to keep energy products out of it, and so therefore Russia will be able to continue exporting energy products and receiving payments for it, which clearly indicates that Europe is not yet willing to wean itself off Russian energy sources. But in the long run, if I was to pass an assessment, I think that the Western states, or the West generally, particularly the United States, has played this particular part of this particular part of the game with Mr. Putin very, very well. Coming to And therefore, I mean, to finish with that part of it, I don't think that any prediction made today will stand whatever the developments are in the next 48 hours. So therefore, I'm not attempting to make any prediction of how I think these developments will flow. The position of India, I understand the temptation to move the Indian position to a more explicit one from where it is today. But I would like people to go back a little bit in history, and if you recall, go back to Afghanistan if you want. If you recall, at that point of time, we, in fact, one of our ambassadors had to quit from the UN because we were not willing to take a public stand. Whereas in private, I know Mrs. Gandhi gave Gromyko a dressing down, but publicly, we were definitely not against, and subsequently, we were supportive of the Najibullah government and whatever came. I mean, of course, after the first two governments fell, but that was India's position. Today, or rather, a couple of days ago, at the United Nations, we were willing to express our unhappiness with the Russian intervention, or we didn't call it an invasion, but nevertheless, that is already a long journey performed, in my opinion. The second thing is, while it is tempting again to switch to a different gear on this issue, I think one has to understand the problem of how difficult it will be for us to wean ourselves away from the dependence on Russia, not just militarily, but in certain other fields also. And the point here is, you will not be able to wean yourself away successfully if you start making those declarations in public that this is your intent. Because the Russians surely are not going to be a collaborative partner in helping you wean yourself away from them. So I foresee for the future that we are likely to do this tightrope walk and dance on this rope that keeps shaking. But I hope we are successful in performing this high wire trapeze act. And I don't see any other option as of now. Final thing is, I would not. I mean, I'm not a nuclear expert. Rajesh is far superior, and he seems quite sanguine about it. But I personally was quite rattled by what the Russians have done with going public with these nuclear exercises. I mean, maybe the status has been raised only by one, but raising the very possibility of that, because the threat of Western powers intervening in Ukraine is negligible, even at the best of times. So I don't know. I felt that that was a step too far. I'll stop with that, Nivedita. I think I've overshot my time in any case.
Thanks, sir. We'll come to some of these issues, but after Dr. Pant makes her initial remarks. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Nivedita. So, a lot has been already said, and we are all aware of the Russian concerns and motives that has drawn it towards the military intervention in Ukraine. For me, what is important, what I find important is the timing of this intervention, because this has been going on for a long time. And when I compare it with 2014, so at that point of time, when in 2000 towards the end of 2013, the major motive was it all began with Yanukovych backing out of abruptly backing out of the association agreement. So at that point of time, there was a lot of focus on EU's neighborhood policy, Eastern Partnership, how ambiguous the European Union was in terms of offering Ukraine and other countries of the Eastern Partnership something, carrots, of market. Market availability, etc., and how Russia did not like it as such. So Yanukovych, abandonment of the deal and his taking a stance that it does not want to antagonize Russia, and so later on. So what I'm trying to say here is at that particular time it was EU that was in focus, and now when I compare that with this particular incident, the focus is on NATO. And the end result is when Mr. Zelensky is making those speeches, he's not talking about the NATO membership anymore, but is definitely appealing to the European Union to definitely consider the question of Ukraine's membership, as if this is the time for taking a call in this regard. Now, as has been said, the crisis, the Georgian crisis, the Ukraine crisis in 14, and again, this particular incident has brought back focus to this region, which has uh, really vacillated between the Western and Russian. Choices, and how it has been trying to make use of best of both worlds. But in this case, what strikes in terms of, because I've been looking at Russian media closely these days, what strikes here is that why would President Putin choose this particular timing when it is evidently clear that China and not Russia is the major challenge in terms of new and emerging technologies, and despite the divergences between US and Russia, there had been some diplomatic channels that were on. So why this particular timing to start with? So I go back to, I mean, this has been going on for some time, but when I look at it in retrospect, Putin's, this long paper in July last year was important. Basically, when you compare that with the speeches that he has given out on 21st and 24th of February, you can see that a stage was being set. It started off with, a normal, very academic, historical background of everything, which was not taken very seriously by anyone. Then towards the end of the year, he goes on to demand security guarantees from NATO, makes it public, makes it known that he wants it, and when gives it about 3 months time, and then goes ahead with a military intervention. So the stage is set, and it shows his frustration to I see it as his frustration to get the attention from the West. I mean, diplomacy was happening for sure, but as usual, this issue has dragged on for so long that he sort of, to quote a Chinese scholar here, he's used escalation to de-escalate the situation, because the end goal, as Mr. Unnikrishnan also said, is not the occupation of Ukraine, but to put a stop to the question of NATO membership. I think he achieves this to some extent by this escalation to keep it. But yes, although I feel this was planned, the kind of resistance that came from the Ukrainians was not expected, and that is why this has dragged on for longer than it should have, or what they had expected would have. So I see two or three reasons for this timing. One is, as this issue lingers on, and if this issue lingers on for a few more years, or maybe say a decade, the population who's aware of the Soviet identity, who's aware of the Soviet glory, if one were to put it that way, is not going to be there. So this is the moment, this is like sort of the time where he can still make this, and get, as he still has popularity ratings in Russia. He can still convince his people, okay, this is something that was in the past, and this can go forward. So with the new population who was born post 2000, who would have no idea about the Soviet Union and its glory, it is just the time to reverse the things that were done in the past. Second, I think it also could be connected with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and US retreating from the war stage in general. It is clear that for US the domestic priorities are high, and China, Indo-Pacific, all these issues were to be the main priority. So in this respect, the positions reverses. For example, in the 90s and early 2000, it was Russia, who was looking to integrate with the West, but it was not really. It was a weak actor at that point of time and did not get the kind of attention or the kind of response it was hoping. So in this case, as it sees the US, retreating on what stage, it knows it will not get the kind of reaction from the US as it would have gotten, say, about 10 to 15 years ago. So that could be a one thing. Third point here would be its relationship with China. So Russia China, even if we call it a transactional partnership, it is going to go strong in the sense that it has backing from China. It's not easy. I mean, it has used the sanctions to its advantage, come up with a lot of domestic measures, measures like import substitution. So it has used past sanctions to its advantage. Even though the present sanctions are much tougher, it has made some preparations. Russia and China are among the few, have always been talking about alternate systems to SWIFT, etc. So this gives them an opportunity to come up with alternative models, alternative systems. I don't know how much they'll succeed, but at least it paves that possibility. They will work towards it harder than they would have without such a response from the US or EU. So now important, and I don't know, I'm just assuming here, questioning here whether China was, or to what extent China was aware of Russian plans, because uh, Russia China relationship, in my eye, is going to grow stronger despite whatever problems they have, historical realities and so on. At this point of time, it has been very clear, it has become very clear that the two need each other. And it if at all China was aware, and if even if it was not, Russia and China coming together sort of shifts that, takes that balance away from the West. There is a new world order emerging, and Russia and China are going to play an important role. What sort of partnership it takes vis-a-vis Russia junior, that is a different issue altogether. But then they are shifting the word, the balance of world order towards east, where China would remain important. So I think, seen in this context, Russia's actions become a bit clear, so to say. Now coming to India, it's very clear, it is very predictable, the kind of stance India
Himani,
has.
I would request you to be very short with this part, right? Thanks.
Okay. So it is very clear the kind of approach India has taken towards this entire situation. And because all has already been said, I'll just add one point here. It would definitely have an impact on people to people ties, because, and especially student exchanges, not only for Ukraine but also Russia, because given the situation and evacuation that are going on, students would not really feel desire to go to a country where such situation is arising, irrespective of whether they're going to Russia or Ukraine. So student exchanges can affect, which would affect India as well as these countries. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Pant. And I'm glad you spoke about the Russia-China equation, because that's what I'm thinking for the next question, for the what I want the entire panel to think this through. Because while we are not exactly sure as to where this conflict will eventually end, what are Russia's end goals, what will be the outcome of the talks, but I think we can all agree that this will have a wide ranging impact on Russian foreign policy going forward, how it engages with the West, how it engages with the non West. So, what I would ask all of you to consider is how will the how do you think the Russian foreign policy is going to shift, and how will that impact how India deals with Russia? So is your suggestion going to be India should stay the course? Or are you saying India should adjust its course when it comes to India's policy towards Russia? Or should we completely reverse the course? So, what would, if you were advising the Indian government about its policy towards Russia, how would you advise that we navigate the situation now? So, may I request Mr. Unnikrishnan to go first?
Ouch. One is, I think it is seriously presumptuous of me to attempt to even advise anyone. I am a bad advisor to myself. But first, on the question of Russia, China, I think they'll distinctly grow closer. There is, with the kind of sanctions that the West has so far announced, and with probably more in store, uh, Russia will have little choice but to hope that China will help relieve some of the pain that all this is causing. My question, however, would be slightly different because I've been watching over the past 3 days the reactions from China. I mean, not the UN and the public foreign policy reactions, but business. And the business is trying to actually draw down its engagement with the Russians. So clearly, Chinese businesses value their relationship with the United States more than the one they have with Russia. But there is a state that can order a change around. But how far will that state want to do it? Because after 2014, that was the hope the Russians had. And if you ask them, let's say, before this crisis, what they thought of it, they were not shy to say that they felt that the Chinese did not live up to their expectations. I have a strong suspicion the same will happen. So, in this particular situation, and this is why, from an Indian perspective, it may be more dangerous, it is the Russians who require China more than the Chinese who require Russians. I think the Chinese will operate on the basis that they will use Russia as this little stick and hope to negotiate something with the United States on the side. How does India have to react? Well, you know, again, if you're taking reactions at the United Nations and all, I'm not really concerned about, you know, does India abstain, not abstain, vote against Russia, for Russia. Those are all diplomatic stances. But I'm worried about a different thing that, irrespective of what happens at that end, uh, I am not sanguine about India's efforts. Uh, I'm not sanguine about India's efforts to build its own economic might. Because unless you build your own economic capabilities, you will never be able to reduce your dependence on any one source. Whether the source is Russia or the United States is immaterial. You do not become a great power in international politics on the basis of importing sensitive technologies. Some may be, but not basic technologies, particularly military technologies. So I am worried because we don't seem to be displaying the kind of focus and haste on that front. And we are missing opportunities, in my opinion. Uh, so, therefore, again, coming back to it, since we don't have that indigenous capability, it will be very, very difficult for us to wean ourselves away from the Russians. And if that becomes a complicated process, then of course, uh, the closeness that Russia develops with China will probably add multiple wrinkles and make it even more complicated when India will be forced to dance on one leg rather than two legs. But even then, my worry is that India will not be able to move away from Russia fully. Uh, the final issue I would like to point out, and this is me being my usual cynical self, is that, diplomatic solution in Belarus notwithstanding, if you cold-blooded analysis of the situation between Russia and United States, the US has effectively achieved what it wanted. It has lined up all its allies behind it. They are now unbreakable iron brothers, as the Chinese would love to say. They are not going anywhere. And the US can shift its focus because everyone is very clear about what is happening, and the US has no intention of fighting in Ukraine. The only party that has got a slightly unresolved agenda are the Russians, who have yet to effect the regime change or get any promises of neutrality out of Ukraine. So that situation is still fraught with possibilities. But the positive side is that the Russians also have achieved in some ways what they wanted. Ukraine is never going to be a NATO member as long as these areas continue to be under Russian occupation. Even if Russia withdraws from Kiev and leaves Kharkiv on its own, the point of these two territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, are sufficient guarantors of the fact that Ukraine cannot join NATO. And as long as it doesn't join NATO, uh, I suspect the Russians will have to be happy with that. EU, of course, is a completely different kettle of fish.
Thanks, sir. I will address the same question to Dr. Singh, and I'll also, additionally, because Mr. Unnikrishnan talked about India's dependence on Russia on various fronts, but especially the defense supplies. So, we have heard all of this talk of how this dependence on Russian weapons might come back to haunt us in the future. But is it realistic? How realistic would it be for India to start diversifying away from Russia? I mean, what kind of timeline are we talking about? Right? What kind of resources will we have to invest to do that? And also, is it necessary to do it? Would you say this is the time to start diversifying away?
Sure. So before I get to that, can I just make a comment on the world order aspect that we're talking about when you look at US-China relations, Russia-China relations, and what could happen after this crisis? I think one of the things uh, that has always been part of this Russian sort of geopolitical orientation towards the West and East is that most of its sort of commodities, natural resources, mineral wealth have been in the Asian part of Russia, while its human capital, political elite, cultural center has been in on the fringes of Europe or in the heart of Europe, as they would like to believe. So I somehow find it, even though, yes, we're facing a crisis, there's a lot of pushback from Western Europe with its economic linkages. But I just recall the kind of interdependence that Western Europe, US has very little stake in those ties. I'm talking of energy, industrial linkages between Germany and Russia, uh, thousands of companies operating in Russia. It cannot all be severed. I think after this crisis, there will be a time when some of that core, because the alternative means then Western Europe will also suffer dramatically economically. I mean, so that's one aspect. So I think, and the Russians do not want to become too dependent on China, right? So they want multiple avenues for whether their technological supply chains, energy supply chains. They would, in fact, like to even go towards Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, which is what they've been doing. So there will be that sense of this greater Eurasia where they are reaching out to Iran. India, of course, is seen as a very important partner in Central Asia. So I think the Russian sort of worldview is sort of much more complex than just swinging from one side to the other. They're going to maintain that. If they don't have Europe for now, they will develop other partners. So uh, I think from India's point of view, coming now to your point of where should we be strategically in terms of military technical ties, I think let's first begin with the fundamental premise that India and most Indians believe in a multipolar world order, right? Uh, its precise dimensions, the way it operates, whether it's going to be based on multilateral institutions or more sort of fragmented networks collaborating with each other and perhaps competing with each other. There are many sort of variations of multipolarity, but on the whole, we believe that a balanced system of multiple power centers is a more stable and sure way of preserving not only Indian sovereignty, security, geopolitical ambitions, and great power status, but it's also stable for world order as well. I mean, I don't think this needs to be proven, right? You saw the unipolar phase, or you see preponderant power in, let's say, the 30s and 40s, early 40s in Europe. Every time you have a concentration of power, the dominant power does not adhere to basic international norms, right? I mean, I'm talking of US intervention, NATO intervention, right, from the 1990s up to the Libyan conflict or even Syria. So I think a balance of power system is something we support. Now, how does that balance of power system come about? It can't just be based on Beijing and Washington, right? It has to be the important military power like Russia, which is not just military strength, right? It's got energy, commodities, wheat, there's high technology. There's so much out there which will further manifest in the coming years and decades to come. The reason why they can't do that is because they're excluded from a lot of the supply chains that the West and Japan have created with China, for example. I mean, just think of the Russian economy if it had even the same amount of FDI from Japan, Korea that China has had. It'll be completely different, right? The Far East will be transformed. So I think the idea that so India has to proceed from the grand strategy that isolating Russia at this time will mean you apni pair pe kulhadi marna. That means you are basically leaving the world in Beijing and Washington's hand in the coming decades, right? Because and how does that world look like? Well, we've seen it in the past, right? With $750 billion of Sino-American trade, I mean, countless hard economic linkages. None of those are planning to be severed by the United States. The Biden administration has crafted a fairly sophisticated China policy. There's competition for sure, but there's by no means any intent, even in their published proclamations, that they are going to roll back or break up these supply chains. That's not happening. So we need Moscow to become an important player in this new multipolar world. I know it's tempting to fall for social media rhetoric and start sort of waving our flags and candles and saying what's going on, but this is hard power realities. You're having a pushback by a critical player in Europe. European security cannot survive without a second pole now. So you're going to have US and NATO, and you're going to have Russia. And I think that's what, if you go back to the dialogue that was happening between the Soviet leadership just when they were disappearing from the scene, and let's say West Germany, France, the UK, and of course the first Bush administration. The whole argument was that as the Cold War ended, which it had ended in 1989, 1990, as German unification is, there will be two pillars to European security. One pillar will be Moscow, and the second will be this Western alliance. Of course, the Soviets disappeared from the scene, and you had this period of a decade of complete chaos. So the second pillar was not available, and the West exploited it, and the power vacuum was filled up. So, but the second pillar is back now, and I think for stable security, that's important, right? Just the way we want India to be a pillar in Indo-Pacific security. So and coming back to the precise nature of military technologies that India receives from Russia, I think there's also a very specific dimension of the types of systems that we get from there and which we can't get from elsewhere, right? I'm talking from a political risk point of view, technologically, a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes in terms of arms transfers, technology training, your submarine program, your missile systems. So there's a whole range of stuff that you can do just because of the legacy and trust that you cannot do with others, right? And they will not even do it if you're willing to even pay 3 times the price that you pay to the Russians financially. So there is that, so this idea of diversification is actually a very superficial argument. The diversification, if anything, should be based on, if you truly have a similar offensive weapon system that you can get from the West without strings attached, and you can secure your supply chain, then go ahead. But I don't think that's ever been on the table, right? We know that the West uses arms control, arms supplies in times of crisis. So, which is why the entire inventory of the Indian military today, if you look at the offensive punch of the Indian armed forces, I think, and this is a statement of fact, is built on Russian systems. So it's not like, and this is despite saying that we want to diversify, right? So it's like these are the options available, And I think we've seen for the past decade, non-nuclear Russian capabilities actually perform in the field, whether it's in Syria, in other parts, and the way they've transferred it elsewhere. So I think coming back philosophically, isolating Russia is not in our advantage. Russia is our neighbor's neighbor, right? The Cotilian logic. For a balance of power in Eurasia and Asia, you need Japan, you need Russia. Of course, you need the United States to the extent that it will remain an important player in the Indo-Pacific, the Western Pacific, and a whole range of other China's neighbors. They have 14 neighbors, right? But this is the largest one. So I think it's unthinkable to even be beginning with that premise. I think if anything, we should be saying, how can we further deepen ties with Russia at a time and actually gain some advantage on various sectors, because now they have finally looking at Asia again. So this conversation, in fact, started in 2014, right? When the argument that Russia is turning east. Did we really exploit it? I mean, I know the Prime Minister went to Vladivostok. We're talking of these Chennai, Vladivostok linkages. But now is the time to now truly gain more out of it. So I suppose that's my sort of broad observation. Thanks.
Thanks. That does make a lot of sense. But Dr. Rajagopalan, would you see the situation in the same light, especially in terms of India's relationship with the United States and how it has been trying to, carry out this balancing act? Because I think just a day or so ago, the U.S. State Department spokesperson said that, India has a relationship with Russia that is distinct from ours, and that's okay. So, do you think we can sort of continue this sort of walking the tightrope, as Nandan sir was saying? Is that possible, or do you think that this is the time where India might shift a bit? So, what's your reading of the situation?
I think I would broadly agree that it is very difficult to shift when 70%, 80% of your arsenal comes from one source. But one of the things that is surprising is for a country that constantly talks about strategic autonomy and multipolarity and whatnot, is that we have become dependent on one country for 70% or 80% of our armory. I mean, it just makes no sense. It doesn't matter who it is to end up at this level of dependence. And what is worse is, of course, that this dependence is to a country which is now a junior partner of our primary adversary. I mean, that, it's obviously a dangerous situation for us. And it is, despite the difficulty that we will face in terms of finding alternative sources, and it is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick, because you can't sort of with great speed convert an armory that is 70% Russian to something else. And that some parts of our the Indian armory will always have to come from Russia for a considerable distance in the future. But the point, first of all, I think the serious question that needs to be asked is how we got ourselves into this jam, despite the fact that the writing was very clear. Um, as Dr. Singh mentioned, I mean, it was very clear as far back as 2014, 8 years back, it was clear what were Indian decision makers doing. I mean, I'm not even going to look into the fact that for 50, 60, 70 years, we were talking about building up our own defense industry and things like that. And we have gotten really not very far if you are dependent on Russia or one country for 70% of your armor, right? I mean, so I think first question is that, but of course there will be time later to consider why we ended up in this jam. But the point is that even at least now, I think we will need to start reducing our dependence. Again, not going to be easy, but that's something that we have to do. But I think in terms of the larger question about where we go, I think it's fine to talk about multipolarity, and from India's perspective, maybe that is India maybe hopes to be one of the poles. But ultimately, polarity in international politics is not something that we can be sure, right? I mean, it can't be conjured up just because we want something. It is basically a polarity simply describes a distribution of power. And as of today, that distribution of power suggests a bipolar system in which the United States and China are the two polar powers, simply because they are the two largest economies, they are the two largest military spenders, and the Chinese military is ramping up enormously. They are building a navy that is going to rival the United States in a couple of years, in a few years. So it is, it's those basic numbers that dictate polarity. We can't change those numbers. I mean, yes, if India grows at 10 or 15% for maybe to 15, 20 years, maybe we may start to make a dent. But the fact is that Russia is nowhere in that equation, because not because we don't want Russia to be, but because Russia's economy is half the size of India's economy. It is 1/10 the size of the European Union. It is about a tenth the size of China's or the United States. Right? It's about less than $2 trillion. So Russia can have all the resources it has, but that doesn't automatically make it into a great power. And its nuclear weapons, what this crisis demonstrates is that even though Russia is not exactly upper volta with nuclear weapons as some people described it, it's nevertheless not very much better than that, right? Because in the sense that the fact that you can tank the Russian economy with a kind of in just a couple of days with what the United States and Europe has done illustrates the fact that Russia is not really a particularly powerful state. I mean, and economic, ultimately wealth is the basis of power, right? I mean, it still has to be converted, and it is possible that you could get away by with military actions, with risk taking, and so on. But ultimately, uh, European economies by itself, European Union by itself, is far, far, far more wealthier than Russia is. And if they, as they are putting their shoulders to it, we can see the shift, dramatic shift that is happening in Europe. So, I mean, I think the problem is that we need to be aware of the fact that the actual balance of power, it's not what the balance of power that we want it to be, right? I mean, nobody wished unipolarity, but that is the balance of power that existed at that point of time, and we had to live with it. And now it is increasingly going to be bipolar. I don't wish it to be bipolar. In fact, I don't really, I think a bipolar world order with China as one of the poles is going to be extremely bad for us. But nevertheless, that is what it is, and we need to recognize that. And if Russia, given the current conditions, and Russia becoming essentially a junior partner of China, especially after this, because now Russia has nowhere to go. It basically has to uh, uh, start, it basically has to take a junior position to China because of the pressure that it is from the West. There isn't a whole lot that we can do about the fact that Russia is where it is. And we need the United States, and we need particularly the United States, because United States is the only country that can actually balance against China even today. I mean, Russia maybe in 10 or 20 or 30, 40 years, if it regains its military power and regains its economic power and its military power and so on, may someday be capable of playing that role. But it is not today, and it is what we have to look at is what it is capable of doing for us today and in the immediate future, which means basically the next 4 or 5 or 6 years. That Russia is not going to be able to play that role. And so it is actually extremely scary to think about the jam that we are in, because considering our dependence, it's basically up to China to dictate to Russia whatever it wants to do. And I'm not sure that Russia can really refuse China on a number of issues, including specifically on potentially arms supplies and resupplies and whatnot with regard to the relationship with India. So, I mean, I think in terms of where we go, we have to sort of consider the current equations, current sort of balance, as it were, a balance of wealth and power, and what it is. And wealth and power doesn't change overnight. I mean, it is something that will take some time to change. And so, I think that is what we need to focus on, and that signal is very clear. I mean, I think it is going to be a bipolar world. and that bipolar system is going to, unfortunately, unlike the last bipolar period, when neither of the polar powers were our neighbors, and therefore we could do this game of playing one off against the other very successfully, and we did that. I mean, more power to us, as it were. But that is not the kind of bipolar system this is, because this is one of the polar powers is our neighbor. It has we have disputes with it, active disputes with it. We have territorial disputes with it. We have political disputes with it. So therefore we can't really do much about that fact, and that means that I think the United States understands that we are in the jam, and they have been extremely careful about not pushing us further in that direction. And I was quite surprised by the statement from the State Department, because I thought they would be much harsher on this. But nevertheless, considering that we are in the jam, we also have to recognize that the United States doesn't require India as much as India requires the United States, for the simple reason that the United States can withdraw back to go back to the United States, I mean, go back to the Western Hemisphere. We have to balance against China irrespective of what happens. So even if we are not allied to the United States, we are not balancing against China because we are doing a favor to the United States. We are balancing against China because that is our requirement. There is nothing we can do about that. We are stuck there. So I think in that sense, we need them a lot more than they need us. And so given all of that, I would think that even though it is going to be difficult, it is not going to be easy. It is not going to be quick either. Reducing India's dependence on Russia is imperative. It should have been done a decade back, but at the very least, we need to start doing that now.
Yeah, I am being told that we only have 3 more minutes in this recording, so I'll give Dr. Pant the last word. So, carrying forward from what Dr. Rajagopalan said, would you agree that it's imperative for India to start diversifying away from Russia, or would you suggest that the current policy still works? 60 seconds, please.
Hi. So I'll just keep it simple. I think India is well positioned to navigate its relationship both with Russia and the US, and it is doing so. There has been some diversification, but I would also say that at this point of time, India, for pragmatic reasons, India should not and cannot afford to isolate Russia, because and anyways, it is important to note here that Russia is playing an important role in the Make in India or Atmanirbhar Bharat also. So even if we were to realize a potential and have that self-reliance, Russia is indeed playing a part. And there is also it is important to note that there is an understanding both in Russia and India, irrespective of our relations with US and China, of our individual relationship with China and the US. There is an understanding that these two relationship will continue, and it has been shown. Russia has not stopped supplying weapons to India after becoming even more close to China. Similarly, India has not taken any decision, as a measure to appease Russia. So I think both are mature partners, which can, which can. Which can keep up with what the other partner is doing, and that is called autonomy. So yes, India is navigating, there is diversification, it should increase, yes, but for the time being it will take some time. And I think I advocate more for stronger economic ties between India and Russia, just for the matter, pulling it away from China to some extent. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I wish we could discuss this further, but we are clearly out of time. I still have a list of questions that I wanted to ask you all. But thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really great discussion, and hope we'll come back in a few days when the situation is clearer and we will be able to discuss this issue further, because this is clearly not the end of it all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.